At 07:42 in the morning, the street ahead froze. Two American Shermans rolled into an intersection that looked empty, too empty, rubble everywhere, broken windows, no movement. The kind of silence that never means safety. Somewhere ahead, unseen, a German Panther was already waiting. The Panther fired first. The first round punched straight through the lead Sherman's gun shield. The second followed almost instantly, landing inches from the first. 3 crewmen were dead before anyone inside the tank understood what had happened. The commander tried to climb out. He made it halfway. His left leg was gone. Inside another tank, a few streets back, Corporal Clarence Smuyer watched it all through his gun sight. He was 21 years old. He came from coal country in Pennsylvania. His father worked the mines. Clarence had never been in a real fight. He had gone hunting, once shot a rabbit, and felt sick afterward. He was not built for killing. He knew that about himself. And yet here he was, crouched behind the main gun of the most powerful tank the United States had brought to Europe, so far watching smoke pour out of a Sherman that had just become a coffin. The Panther was already rotating its gun. Not fast. Calm. Professional. Like it had all the time in the world. For years, American tank crews had learned this lesson the hard way. Their tanks burned fast. Their chances were measured in seconds. If you were hit, you either escaped immediately or you didn't escape at all. No heroics, no second chances. Clarence knew the numbers. Everyone did. German guns could kill American tanks long before American guns could answer back. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't bravery. It was physics. Steel thickness, angles, distance. What made this moment different was the tank he was sitting in. This was not a Sherman. It was bigger, heavier, louder, slower. It hadn't been here before. In fact, only a handful of them existed anywhere near the front. Some German crews hadn't even seen one yet. Others mistook it for something familiar until it fired. Clarence didn't feel brave. He didn't feel ready. He felt very aware of how narrow the street was, how exposed the intersection ahead looked, how quickly everything could end. He rested his hand near the trigger and watched the Panther's barrel continue to swing. A few seconds earlier, 3 men had been alive. Now they weren't. And the question hanging in the smoke-filled air was simple and brutal. Why would this tank survive? When the others didn't, at first glance what happened in that intersection looked like bad luck. Wrong street, wrong timing. One tank visible, another hidden, a few seconds too late. That was the comfortable explanation. The kind commanders liked, the kind reports preferred, the kind that let everyone move on. But bad luck doesn't repeat itself thousands of times across an entire war. The Sherman tank was never meant to fight other tanks, not officially. American doctrine said tanks existed to support infantry, not dual enemy armor. If German tanks appeared, specialized units would handle them. Tank destroyers. Fast, mobile, flexible. On paper, it made perfect sense. On paper, wars are very tidy. In reality, German tanks didn't follow doctrine. They showed up wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted, usually first, and usually already aimed. Panthers and Tigers were built for one purpose: to kill other tanks. They were heavier, better armored, and carried guns designed to punch through steel at long range. When a Panther fired, it didn't hope. It expected results. The Sherman, by contrast, was a compromise. Easy to build, easy to ship, easy to maintain, and easy to lose. Its armor was thin enough that German guns could penetrate it long before the Sherman could respond effectively. If you were inside one when it was hit, your survival depended less on skill and more on whether the ammunition decided to ignite immediately or give you a few seconds of mercy. American crews learned that lesson early, starting in Normandy. They learned it again in the hedgerows where German tanks waited behind fields and stone walls. They learned it in villages on narrow roads and at long distances where their own guns felt suddenly very small. By the time winter arrived, entire units could predict outcomes before the first shot was fired. Then came the Ardennes. The Battle of the Bulge didn't introduce a new problem. It simply made it impossible to ignore. German armored formations smashed into American lines with Panthers and Tiger IIs, and the old assumptions collapsed along with them. Tank destroyers were rarely where they were supposed to be. Infantry support disappeared in snow and fog, and Shermans were forced into fights they were never meant to survive. At that point, the solution already existed. It had existed for years. American engineers had been working on a heavier tank since 1942. Thicker armor, a larger gun, better protection for the crew. Every prototype solved one problem and created another. More weight meant more stress on transmissions. Bigger guns meant stronger recoil. Stronger armor meant slower movement. Each improvement added complexity, and complexity made commanders nervous. Somewhere far from the front, men in offices decided the Sherman was good enough. It had worked in North Africa, they said. It was winning battles, they said. Why change something that wasn't broken? What they really meant was that fixing it would be inconvenient. A heavier tank meant new logistics, new training, new spare parts, new bridges that might not hold it. And in wartime, inconvenience is often treated as a greater threat than enemy fire. So the heavier tank waited, while crews burned. Only after the Ardennes, when losses became impossible to explain away, did the decision finally change. A small number of the new tanks were rushed across the Atlantic. No fanfare, no speeches, just quiet urgency. They arrived too late to save thousands of crews, but just in time to face the final battles of the war. That was the tank Clarence Smuyer was sitting in. Not a miracle machine. Not an invincible weapon. Just a delayed admission that the old thinking had failed. It had more armor, yes. A stronger gun, yes. But more importantly, it gave its crew a fighting chance where none had existed before. And that was the uncomfortable truth behind the burning Shermans. They hadn't been unlucky. They had been sent into combat by a doctrine that belonged to an earlier war against enemies who had already moved on. History rarely announces when it's wrong. It just keeps collecting proof. And war, as always, refuses to wait for theory to catch up. The city was already dead before the tanks arrived. Cologne had once been Germany's fourth largest city. 1 million people, factories, trams, cafes, churches, older than most nations. By March of 1945, it was something else entirely. A skeleton. A hollowed-out shell of stone and smoke where the living hid underground, and the surface belonged to whoever carried a weapon. From inside the Pershing, the city didn't look like a place. It looked like a problem. Rubble filled the streets in uneven waves, forcing the tank to slow, then stop, then crawl forward again. Buildings that still stood leaned at odd angles, their insides exposed like broken ribs. Window frames stared down at street level, dark and empty, each one a potential firing point. Nothing moved. And that was the worst part. Silence in a ruined city didn't mean safety. It meant waiting. Urban combat had its own rules, and none of them favored tanks. A Panther could kill you from hundreds of yards away in open terrain. In a city, the threat was closer, smaller, and much harder to see. Panzerfaust teams didn't need range. They needed 20 feet. A basement window, a doorway, a third-story apartment where someone had dragged a mattress to the edge so they could lean out and drop a Molotov cocktail onto an engine deck. The Pershing had thicker armor than a Sherman, but fire didn't care about armor thickness. Neither did gravity. A bottle of burning fuel hitting the back of the tank could turn the engine compartment into an oven just as efficiently as any German shell. The streets narrowed as Eagle 7 moved deeper into the city. The Pershing's engine rumbled at low throttle, loud enough to echo off the walls, but quiet enough that everyone inside strained to hear over it. The clank of tracks on broken pavement carried farther than anyone liked. Sound bounced unpredictably between collapsed buildings. A noise behind you could be a reflection, or it could be someone very close. Every few dozen yards, the tank stopped. The driver checked the ground ahead. Rubble could hide mines. Shell craters could snap a track. A tank immobilized in a city was not a tank anymore. It was a bunker that everyone could walk around. Infantry moved along the sides of the street when possible, slipping from doorway to doorway, vanishing into shadows. Sometimes they were there. Sometimes they weren't. The city swallowed people quickly. Underground tunnels connected basements across entire blocks. German soldiers called them mouse trails. American infantry learned the name after German troops started appearing behind them, firing and disappearing again before anyone could respond. Snipers used church towers and factory smokestacks. Mortars fell from somewhere unseen. The Pershing's gun traversed slowly, left and right, covering windows, alley, mouths, door frames. Clarence Smuyer watched the city through his sight and felt the weight of it pressing inward. The tank was stronger than a Sherman. Everyone knew that. But it was also heavier. 46 tons of steel did not turn corners easily. Streets that Shermans could navigate without trouble became tight, awkward funnels for the Pershing. Bridges were another concern. Many simply couldn't support the weight. Routes had to be chosen carefully, and in a city, careful often meant predictable. Predictable was dangerous. When the order came, it sounded almost ceremonial. Eagle 7 would lead the advance toward the city's center, first through intersection, first to draw fire, first to find out where the enemy still was. It was described as an honor. It always was. Inside the tank, no one used that word. Leading meant exposure. It meant being the loudest thing on the street, the biggest silhouette, the most valuable target. It meant that if someone was waiting, they were waiting for you. The Pershing rolled forward anyway. Smoke drifted through the streets, carrying the smell of burned masonry and something worse that no one named out loud. Mannequins lay scattered in what had once been a shopping district, their plastic limbs mixed with bricks and shattered glass. A streetcar sat overturned, its windows blown out, frozen, in the middle of the road, as if the war had interrupted it mid-sentence. Radio traffic crackled intermittently. Reports came in from other units. Resistance was lighter than expected in some sectors. In others, it was fierce and sudden. German rear guards were still operating west of the river. Volunteers, fanatics, men who had been told to hold until the last round and saw no reason to stop now. Then the message Yems came that changed everything. German armor had been spotted near the cathedral. At least one Panther, possibly more. The cathedral itself loomed ahead, its twin spires rising above the ruins, untouched by hundreds of bombing raids that had erased everything around it. The spires were landmarks, navigation points, reference markers for every map and every radio transmission. If there was a Panther near the cathedral, it had chosen its position carefully. Wide streets open near the square, longer sight lines, fewer places to hide. For tanks, that meant exposure. For a Panther, it meant time. Time to aim, time to pick targets, time to kill. Clarence felt his mouth go dry as the Pershing slowed. The city seemed to tighten around them. The buildings rose higher, the light dimmed. Smoke hung in the air, turning distance into guesswork. This was the moment the Pershing had been built for. Not a test range, not a training field. A real city, a real enemy, a real gun waiting somewhere ahead. Up to now, the Pershing had been a theory, a solution delayed by years of debate and hesitation. Steel and horsepower meant to correct a mistake. Now it was rolling into a place designed to punish mistakes. Somewhere near the cathedral, a Panther crew was already set, already watching, already calculating angles and distances. They had destroyed Shermans here before. They knew the ground. They knew the kill zones. The Pershing moved forward, slow and deliberate, its gun steady, its crew silent. For the first time, it was about to find out whether it was more than an idea on paper. The first sound came before the sight. 2 heavy booms echoed across the square, followed by the unmistakable crack thump of armor being hit. Then silence. Not the calm kind. The kind that means someone is already dead, and everyone else is counting the seconds until they join them. Through the haze, the Pershing crew saw the first Sherman. It sat at an awkward angle near the edge of the square, its gun tube pointing uselessly upward, smoke pouring from the open commander's hatch. It hadn't stopped to fight. It had stopped because it had been stopped. The second Sherman was somewhere nearby, out of sight, but the radio traffic filled in the rest. Hit, disabled, crew bailing out, taking casualties. The Panther had chosen well. It was positioned to command the square, its long barrel pointed down the avenue the Shermans had used. Wide streets meant long sight lines. Long sight lines meant time. And time was exactly what a Panther needed. Eagle 7 halted 1 block short of the open ground, the Pershing, settling into the shadow of a partially collapsed office building. From here they could see the edge of the square without exposing themselves. The cathedral's twin spires loomed ahead, rising through smoke like indifferent witnesses. Somewhere near their base, the Panther waited. Early didn't rush. He studied the geometry. The Panther couldn't see them yet. The building blocked the line of sight. But if the Pershing rolled straight into the square, the German crew would spot it instantly. 300 yards of open ground. No cover. A frontal duel across that distance would be honest, fair, and probably fatal. Fair fights are overrated. A side street ran parallel to their avenue, partially hidden by rubble and shadow. If the Pershing took it, looped around the block, and entered the square from the west, the Panther's gun would be facing the wrong direction. The turret would have to rotate. Turret rotation took time. Not much time. But sometimes not much was enough. The plan took less than a minute to explain. Inside the turret, hands moved without talking. Ammunition was checked. An armor-piercing round slid into the breech. The turret rotated 90 degrees to the right in anticipation, the gun already aiming where the Panther should appear. No one said the word should out loud. Combat had a habit of punishing assumptions. The Pershing eased into the side street. It was narrower than expected, barely wide enough for 46 tons of steel. Rubble scraped along the hull. The engine note changed as the driver balanced speed and control. Too slow and they'd be sitting ducks. Too fast, and the gunner wouldn't be able to aim. Somewhere behind the walls, the Panther crew would hear them. Sound traveled strangely in cities. Direction was hard to judge. A few seconds of confusion might be all they got. Clarence pressed his eye to the gun sight. 30 yards to the intersection. 20. The Pershing's bow cleared the corner. The Panther was there. It sat exactly where the map suggested, its hull angled slightly, its turret already beginning to move. Someone in that tank was sharp, faster than expected. The long barrel swung toward them, dark and deliberate, the muzzle seeming far larger than it had an innate right to be. The driver made a decision, without asking. He didn't stop. A stationary tank was a dead tank. He drove straight into the intersection, accelerating just enough to throw off the Panther's aim. The Pershing lurched forward, fully exposed, crossing the Panther's line of fire at close range. Everything Clarence had been taught said not to fire on the move. The gun wasn't stabilized. Accuracy dropped. Recoil became unpredictable. Firing while moving was for emergencies, for desperation, for when the alternative was worse. This was all three. He didn't wait for the tank to settle. He compensated instinctively, leading the target, by a fraction squeezing the trigger as the Pershing bounced over broken stone. The 90-millimeter gun fired the recoil, slamming through the turret. The first round hit high. Metal sparked across the Panther's turret face just below the gun mantlet. It was a solid hit, loud and violent, but not enough. The German tank was still alive, still moving, still dangerous. The Pershing skidded to a stop in the middle of the square, exposed from every direction. Inside the turret, the loader was already moving. Another armor-piercing round slammed home. The breech locked. The process was mechanical, practiced faster than thought. Clarence never took his eye off the sight. The Panther's turret was still rotating. That was the window. He adjusted his aim lower, targeting the side armor beneath the turret ring. Thinner steel. Vulnerable. The place every tank crew memorized, even if they never expected to see it this close. He fired again. The second round punched through the Panther's side armor, passed through the fighting compartment, and tore out the far side in a shower of metal and flame. Inside, the German tank systems failed almost instantly. Hydraulics ruptured. Ammunition ignited. Smoke poured from seams and hatches. The Panther was finished. Its commander threw open the hatch and jumped, hitting the pavement hard and rolling away. Another crewman followed. One did not. Flames climbed higher, fed by fuel and hydraulic fluid, wrapping the turret in orange and black. The Panther burned in front of the cathedral, visible from every street that fed into the square. 45 seconds. From first sight to burning wreck, the duel was over almost as soon as it began. The Pershing sat still, engine idling, gun trained on the wreck, out of habit rather than necessity. No one cheered. No one spoke. The silence returned heavier than before. Clarence leaned back from the gun sight. His hands were shaking. The city seemed to hold its breath. Smoke drifted across the square. Somewhere, glass shattered as heat cracked what was left of windows. The cathedral stood unchanged, its stone, indifferent to the small violence that had just unfolded at its feet. The Pershing had proven something, but not in the way anyone had imagined in a briefing room. It hadn't won because it was superior on paper. It hadn't won because doctrine had finally caught up with reality. It had won because a handful of people had made the right decisions in the wrong place, under pressure, that no manual could fully prepare them for. The Panther continued to burn. Ammunition cooked off inside the hull, sending sparks and fragments into the air for hours afterward. By the time infantry cautiously moved into the square, the fight was already history. The enemy armor that had controlled the approach was gone. The square was open. Victory arrived quietly. No flags, no speeches. Just a burned-out tank, a surviving crew, and the understanding that the difference between survival and death had been measured not in technology, but in seconds. And seconds in war are never generous. The city did not applaud. There were no cheers when the Panther burned out. No sense of closure. Just smoke, heat, and the uneasy quiet that follows violence when everyone realizes the danger hasn't actually gone anywhere. The Pershing rolled on because that was what tanks did. They didn't linger. They moved, they cleared, they advanced. Victory, such as it was, came with a schedule. A few blocks from the square, the street narrowed again. Buildings leaned inward, forming a corridor, barely wider than the tank itself. The light dimmed. Sound flattened. The city returned to its familiar rhythm of tension and waiting. Then the car appeared. It burst into the intersection from a side street, black civilian, moving fast and weaving through debris. For a split second, it looked wrong simply because it was moving. Civilians had been evacuated weeks earlier. Anything still driving in Cologne was either military or trying very hard not to be. Clarence tracked it through the site. Training didn't offer much guidance here. There was no checklist for uncertainty. The vehicle didn't carry markings, didn't slow. Somewhere nearby, German positions were still active. Urban combat compressed decisions until they became instincts. He fired the machine gun. Tracers cut across the intersection. Glass shattered. The car jerked and rolled to a stop. Almost simultaneously, fire came from another direction. A German Panzer IV, hidden behind a collapsed building, had also engaged the vehicle. Two tanks, opposing sides, firing at the same target from different angles. When the shooting stopped, the street was quiet again. The driver slumped forward. A passenger door opened. A figure fell onto the cobblestones and didn't move. The Pershing never took a hit. The German tank withdrew and disappeared behind rubble. The moment passed the way moments in war often do, abruptly without explanation, leaving behind more questions than answers. Clarence didn't know who had fired the fatal shots. He didn't know if the bullets that killed the passenger came from his gun or the German tanks. He only knew that he had fired, and that someone was dead because of it. There was no investigation, no pause. The city was still hostile, and the advance continued. Orders came in. The tank moved. Another intersection, another street, another task. War had no mechanism for processing guilt in real time. Years later, the war still hadn't ended. Clarence went home after the fighting stopped. He worked. He married. He built a life that looked ordinary from the outside. He rarely spoke about Cologne. He didn't need to. The city followed him anyway. At night, it came back. The cathedral spires rising through smoke. The Panther burning, and always the car. The brief flash of motion, the falling figure. The moment that refused to resolve itself. He lived with uncertainty for decades, not knowing who she was, not knowing whose rounds had killed her, not knowing whether responsibility could be shared or if that was just something people said to survive. Time passed the way it always does, relentlessly. Friends died. Family faded. The war aged inside him while the world moved on. Then late in life, clarity arrived in the most unwelcome way. A German journalist traced the incident through archives and witness accounts. The passenger had a name, Katharina Esser, 26 years old, a civilian. She had been trying to leave the city with her employer when she was caught in the crossfire. She was not a soldier. She was not a threat. She was simply there. Clarence learned the truth decades after the trigger was pulled. It did not bring relief. He returned to Cologne as an old man, not to revisit the battlefield, but to stand at a grave. He expected solitude. What he found instead was another survivor waiting for him. Gustav Schaefer had been a gunner in the Panzer IV that fired at the same car. He had lived with the same question for the same number of years. He too believed he might have killed her. He too carried the weight. They stood together where enemies had once tried to kill each other and said very little. There were no speeches, no explanations that could balance the scales. Just two men acknowledging a shared memory that neither could undo. They placed flowers on Katerina's grave. Neither knew whose bullets had ended her life. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. War did not offer certainty, only consequences. What mattered was not precision, but participation. They had been part of the moment. And the moment had followed them home. They stayed in contact after that. Letters crossed borders. Conversations replaced silence. The war, which had once defined them as enemies, now connected them as witnesses to the same loss. Clarence lived long enough to receive recognition for his service. Medals were pinned. Hands were shaken. Photographs were taken. None of it changed the nights. When he died, nearly a century old, the city of Cologne remained. Rebuilt, busy, alive. The cathedral still stood unchanged. The Panther existed only in photographs. The Pershing sat in a museum. And Katharina Esser lay in the ground remembered. That was the part of the story that endured, not the tank. Not the gun, not the duel measured in seconds. The story was never about armored warfare. It was about what follows you home when the shooting stops, and how some wars refuse to end.